Hello, and I am Candy, the storybook lady. Thank you for joining me another night of Liberty Readers. We continue in our journey as we read through A Horse and His Boy, which is the third book in the Chronicles of Narnia. And we're more than halfway through at this point, and a lot has been going on, and I can't wait to finish to get reading today and see what else we find out. But so far, we have Shasta, right? He's the main character, and what is Shasta doing? Yes, he has run away from home and he's on his way to Narnia. Who is accompanying Shasta? Correct, it's going to be Bree, his horse, or the horse. It's also going to be Aravis, a young lady, and Hwin, right? And she's another horse. What's special about Hwin and Bree? That's right. They talk, right? They're talking horses and they're actually from Narnia and they're returning. And Aravis is a young lady and she's also running away. So they've all kind of met together through circumstances and they're journeying through Narnia. They had to stop at a city called Tashban, and a lot happened there, right? What happened in Tashban? There's a lot that happened in Tashban. So first they got separated, right? And Shasta on his journey, he ended up with the king and queen of Narnia, which would be King Edmund and his sister Queen Susan. And Queen Susan was kind of seeing this other guy named the prince that was in Tashban, and he wasn't so nice as she thought he was. And then he tried to corner her and get married. And so when Shasta's with them, they're planning their own escape from Tashban to go back to Narnia, and they believed that Shasta was who? Right. They thought he was Prince Corin. And Shasta didn't know who that was, but as he's trying to get out, Prince Corin comes tumbling in. And what's unusual about that? Absolutely. They look like each other. And that was weird, and they kind of became fast friends, but it was kind of quick, and so Shasta leaves, Prince Cornwall comes in, and then we don't know. We believe that they carried out their plan, King Edmund and Queen Susan, to escape back to Narnia by ship. So, what happens to Arvis? Yes, she meets an old friend who's kind of rich, and she has to prevent her from, blowing her cover because she's running away. So she ends up with her friend, and in order to escape, what are they doing, or what do they do? Right, they end up at the palace, right, where the prince is, as well as the king, and they actually get stuck in a room with who? Yeah, the prince, the king, and the man Aravis is running away from to marry. So a lot going on. They overhear their plans. The prince is upset Queen Susan ran away, and now he wants to chase after her, and he's convincing his dad to take over Narnia. And after a lot of whining and complaining, his dad finally is like, okay, but if you go, I don't know anything about it. So the prince is on his own. So he runs and starts his journey with a bunch of, pretty much an army, towards Narnia. And then what happens? Yes, so finally, Arvis and Hwin and Shasta and Bree are finally all brought together, and they continue on their journey, and they're going to try to kind of cut off the prince and warn the Narnians. And so they're headed that way. So where are we now? Yeah, so they went through a long journey through the desert, very hard. We talked about that last week, and now they're finally at the place toward to Archenland, which is the city, I guess, neighboring Narnia, or the country neighboring Narnia, and so they're finally making their way through there. But what's behind them? Yeah, they got two problems. They have both a lion chasing them and the prince's army directly on their heels. So right in the middle of that. And so we got to get started and see what's going to happen. So I'll start here. It was a little bit of last time. This is Shasta. He looked over his shoulder. Everything was only too clear. A huge, tawny creature. its body low to the ground like a cat streaking across the lawn to a tree when a strange dog has got into the garden, was behind them, and it was nearer every second and half second. He looked forward again and saw something which he did not take in, or even think about. There was a barred Their way was barred by a smooth green wall about 10 feet high. In the middle of that wall there was a gate, open. In the middle of the gateway stood a tall man, dressed down to his bare feet in a robe colored like autumn leaves, leaning on a straight staff. His beard fell almost to his knees. Shasta saw all this in a glance and looked back again. The lion had almost got Hwin now. It was making snaps at her hind legs, and there was no hope now in her foam-flecked, wide-eyed face. "Stop!" bellowed Shasta in Bree's ear. "Must go back. Must help." Bree always said afterward that he never heard or never understood this, and he was in general a very truthful horse, so we must accept his word. Shasta slipped his feet out of the stirrups, slid both his legs over the side of the left side, hesitated for one hideous hundredth of a second, and jumped. It hurt horribly and nearly winded him, but before he knew how it hurt him, he was staggering back to help Aravis. He had never done anything like this in his life before, and hardly knew why he was doing it now. One of the most terrible noises in the world, a horse's scream, broke from Hwin's lips. Aravis was stooping low over Hwin's neck and seemed to be trying to draw her sword, and now all three, Aravis, Hwin, and the lion, were almost on top of Shasta. Before they reached him, the lion rose on his hind legs, larger than you would have believed a lion could be, and jabbed at Aravis with his right paw. Shasta could see all the terrible claws extended. Aravis screamed and reeled in the saddle. The lion was tearing at her shoulders. Shasta, half mad with horror, managed to lurch toward the brute. He had no weapon, not even a stick or a stone. He shouted out, idiotically, at the lion as one would do a dog, "Go home! Go home!" For a fraction of a second he was staring right into its wide-opened, raging mouth. Then, to his utter astonishment, the lion, still on its hind legs, checked itself suddenly, turned head over heels, picked itself up, and rushed away. Shasta did not for a moment suppose it had gone for good. He turned and raced for the gate in the green wall which, now for the first time, he remembered seeing. Hwin, stumbling and nearly fainting, was just entering the gate. Aravis still kept her seat, but her back was covered with blood. "Come in, my daughter, come in," the robed and bearded man was saying, and then, "Come in, my son," as Shasta panted up to him. He heard the gate close behind him, and the bearded stranger was already helping Aravis off her horse. They were in a wide and perfectly circular enclosure, protected by a high wall of green turf. A pool of perfectly still water, so full of the water that was almost exactly level with the ground, lay before him. At one end of the pool, completely overshadowing it with its branches, there grew the hugest and most beautiful tree that Shasta had ever seen. Beyond the pool was a little low house of stone roofed with deep and ancient thatch. There was a sound of bleating, and over at the far side of the enclosure there were some goats. The level ground was completely covered with the finest grass. Are you King Lune of Archenland?" panted Shasta. The old man shook his head. "No," he replied in a quiet voice. "I am the hermit of the Southern March. And now, my son, waste no time on questions, but obey. This damsel is wounded. Your horses are spent. Rapidash at this moment finding a ford over the winding Arrow. If you run now, without a moment's rest, you will still be in time to warn King Lune." Shasta's heart fainted at these words, for he felt he had no strength left, and he writhed inside at what seemed the cruelty and unfairness of the demand. He had not yet learned that if you do one good deed, your reward usually is to be set to do another, and a harder and better one. But all he said out loud was, "Where's the king?" The hermit turned and pointed with his staff. "Look," he said, "there is another gate right opposite to the one you entered by. Open it and go straight ahead, always straight ahead. Over level or steep, over smooth or rough, over dry or wet. I know by my art that you will find King Loon straight ahead. But run, run, always run." Shasta nodded his head, ran to the northern gate, and disappeared beyond it. Then the hermit took Aravis, whom he had all this time been supporting with his left arm, and half led, half carried her into the house. After a long time he came out again. "Now, cousins," he said to the horses, "it is your turn." Without waiting for an answer, and indeed they were too exhausted to speak, he took the bridles and saddles off both of them. Then he rubbed them both down so well that a groom in a king's stable could not have done it better. "There, cousins," he said, "dismiss it all from your minds and be comforted. Here is water, and there is grass. You shall have a hot mash when I've milked my other cousins, the goats." "Sir," said Hwin, finding her voice at last, "will the Tarkheena live? Has the lion killed her?" "I who know many present things by my art," replied the hermit with a smile, "have yet little knowledge of things future. Therefore I do not know whether any man or woman or beast in the whole world will be alive when the sun sets tonight. But be of good hope. The damsel is likely to live as long as any her age." When Aravis came to herself, she found that she was lying on her face on a low bed of extraordinary softness in a cool, bare room with walls of undressed stone. She couldn't understand why she had been laid on her face, but when she tried to turn and felt the hot, burning pains all over her back, she remembered and realized why. She couldn't understand what delightfully springy stuff the bed was made of, because it was made of heather, which is the best bedding, and heather, which was a thing she had not heard of. The door opened and the hermit entered, carrying a large wooden bowl in his hand. After carefully setting this down, he came to the bedside and asked, "How do you find yourself, my daughter?" "My back is very sore, father," said Aravis, "but there is nothing else wrong with me." He knelt beside her, laid his hand on her forehead, and felt her pulse. "There is no fever," he said. "You will do well. Indeed, there is no reason why you should not get up tomorrow, but now drink this." He fetched the wooden bowl and held it to her lips. Aravis couldn't help making a face when she tasted it, for goat's milk is rather a shock when you're not used to it. But she was very thirsty and managed to drink it all, and felt better when she had finished. "Now, my daughter, you may sleep when you wish," said the hermit, "for your wounds are washed and dressed, and though they smart, they are no more serious than if they had been the cuts of a whip. Must have been a very strange lion, for instead of catching you out of the saddle and getting his teeth into you, he has only drawn his claws across your back. 10 scratches. Sore, but not deep or dangerous." "I say," said Aravis, "I have had luck." "Daughter," said the hermit, "I have now lived 109 winters in this world, and have never yet any such thing as luck. There is something about all this that I do not understand, but if ever we need to know it, you may be sure that we shall." "And what about Rabadash and his 200 horses?" asked Aravis. "They will not pass this way, I think," said the hermit. "They must have found a ford by now, well to the east of us. From there they will try to ride straight to Onvard." "Oh, poor Shasta," said Aravis. "Has he far to go? Will he get there first? There is good hope of it, said the old man. Aravis lay down again on her side this time and said, Have I been asleep for a long time? It seems to be getting dark. The hermit was looking out of the only window, which faced north. This is not the darkness of night, he said presently. The clouds are falling down from the stormness head. Our foul weather always comes from there in these parts. There will be a thick fog tonight. Next day, except for her sore back, Aravis felt so well that after breakfast, which was porridge and cream, the hermit said she could get up. And of course she at once went to speak to the horses. The weather had changed, and the whole of that green enclosure was filled like the great green cup with sunlight. It was a very peaceful place, lonely and quiet. Hwin at once trotted across to Aravis and gave her a horse kiss. But where's Bree? Said Aravis, when each had asked after the other's health and sleep. Over there, said Hwin, pointing her nose to the far side of the circle, and I'd wish you'd come and talk to him. There's something wrong. I can't get a word out of him. They strolled across and found Bree lying with his face toward the wall, and though he must have heard them coming, he never turned his head or spoke a word. Good morning, Bree, said Aravis. How are you this morning? But Bree muttered something that no one could hear. The hermit says that Shasta probably got to King Lune in time, continued Aravis, so it looks as if all our troubles are over. Narnia at last, Bree. I shall never see Narnia, said Bree in a low voice. Aren't you well, Bree dear? Said Aravis. Bree turned round at last, his face mournful, as only a horse's can be. I shall go back to Calormen, he said. What? Said Aravis. Back to slavery? Yes, said Bree. Slavery is all I'm fit for. How can I ever show my face among the free horses of Narnia? I, who left a mare and a girl and a boy to be eaten by lions, while I galloped all I could to save my own wretched skin. We all ran as hard as we could, said Hwin. Shasta didn't, snorted Bree. At least he ran in the right direction, ran back. And that is what shames me most of all. I, who have called myself a war horse, and boasted of 100 fights, to be beaten by a little human boy, a child, a mere foal, who had never held a sword nor had any good nurture or example in his life. I know, said Aravis. I felt just the same. Shasta was marvelous. I'm just as bad as you, Bree. I've been snubbing him and looking down on him ever since you met us, and now he turns out to be the best of us all. But I think it would be better to stay and say we're sorry than go back to Calormen. It's all very well for you, said Bree. You haven't disgraced yourself. But I've lost everything. My good horse, said the hermit, who had approached them unnoticed because his bare feet made so little noise in the sweet dewy grass. My good horse, you've lost nothing but your self-conceit. No, no, cousin, don't put back your ears and shake your mane at me. If you are really so humbled as you sounded a minute ago, you must learn to listen to sense. You're not quite the great horse you had come to think, from living among poor dumb horses. Of course you were braver and cleverer than them. You could hardly help being that. It doesn't follow that you'll be anyone very special in Narnia. But as long as you know you're nobody very special, you'll be a very decent sort of horse on the whole, and taking one thing with another. And now, if you and my other four-footed cousin will come round to the kitchen door, we'll see about the other half of that mash. When Shasta went through the gate, he found a slope of grass and a little heather running up before him into some trees. He had nothing to think about now and no plans to make. He had only to run, and that was quite enough. His limbs were shaking a terrible stitch and was beginning in his side, and the sweat that kept dropping into his eyes blinded them, and made them smart. He was unsteady on his feet too, and more than once he nearly turned his ankle on a loose stone. The trees were thicker now than they had yet been, and in the more open spaces that were bracken, the sun had gone in without making it any cooler. It had become one of those hot, gray days when there seemed to be twice as many flies as usual. Shasta's face was covered with them. He didn't even try to shake them off. He had too much else to do. Suddenly, he heard a horn. Not a great throbbing horn like the horns of Tashbaan, but a merry tit-rit-tit-hoo. Next moment, he came out into a wide glade and found himself in a crowd of people. At least it looked to him like a crowd. In reality, there were about 15 or 20 of them, all gentlemen in green hunting dress, with their horses, some in the saddle and some standing by their horses' heads. In the center, someone was holding the stirrup for a man to mount, and the man he was holding it for was the jolliest, fat, apple-cheeked, twinkling-eyed king you could imagine. As soon as Shasta came in sight, this king forgot all about mounting his horse. He spread up his arms to Shasta, his face lit, and cried out in a great deep voice that seemed to come from the bottom of his chest. "Corin, my son! And on foot and in rags, what?" "No," panted Shasta, shaking his head. "Not Prince Corin. I know I'm like him. Saw his highness in Tashbaan. Sent his greetings." The king was staring at Shasta with an extraordinary expression on his face. "Are you King Lune?" gasped Shasta. And then, without waiting for an answer, "Lord King, fly, Anvard, shut the gates. Enemies upon you. Rabadash, and 200 horse." "Have you assurance of this, boy?" asked one of the under gentlemen. "My own eyes," said Shasta. "I've seen them. Raced them all the way from Tashbaan." "On foot?" said the gentleman, raising his eyebrows a little. "Horses, with the hermit," said Shasta. "Question him no more, Darren," said the King Lune. "I see truth in his face. We must ride for it, gentlemen. A spare horse for the boy. You can ride fast, friend?" For answer, Shasta put his foot up in the stirrup of the horse which had been led toward him, and a moment later he was in the saddle. He had done it 100 times with Bree in the last few weeks, and his mounting was very different now from what it had been on that first night when Bree had said that he climbed up a horse as if he were climbing a haystack. He was pleased to hear the Lord Darren say to the king, "The boy has a true horseman's seat, sire. I'll warrant there's noble blood in him." "His blood, there's the point," said the king. And he stared hard at Shasta again, with that curious expression, almost a hungry expression, in his steady gray eyes. But by now the whole party was moving off at a brisk canter. Shasta's seat was excellent, but he was sadly puzzled what to do with the reins, for he had never touched the reins while he was on Bree's back. But he looked very carefully out the corners of his eyes to see what the others were doing, as some of us have done at parties when we weren't quite sure which knife or fork we were meant to use, and tried to get his fingers right. But he didn't dare to try really directing the horse. He trusted it would follow the rest. The horse was, of course, an ordinary horse, not a talking horse. But it had quite wits enough to realize that the strange boy on his back had no whip and no spurs. It was not really master of the situation. That is why Shasta soon found himself at the tail end of the procession. Even so, he was going pretty fast. There were no flies now, and the air in his face was delicious. He had got his breath back, too, and his errand had succeeded for the first time since the arrival at Tashbaan. How long ago it seemed. He was beginning to enjoy himself. He looked up to see how much nearer the mountain tops had come. To his disappointment, he could not see them all, only a vague grayness rolling down toward them. He had never been in mountain country before and was surprised. "It's a cloud," he thought to himself. "A cloud coming down, I see. Up there in the hills, one is really in the sky. I shall see what the inside of a cloud looks like. What fun! I've often wondered." Far away on his left, and a little behind him, the sun was getting ready to set. They had come to a rough kind of road by now and were making very good speed, but Shasta's horse was still the last of the lot. Once or twice, when the road made a bend, there was now a continuous forest on each side of it. He lost sight of the others for a second or two. Then they plunged into the fog, or else the fog rolled over them. The world became gray. Shasta had not realized how cold and wet the inside of a cloud would be, nor how dark. The gray turned to black with alarming speed. Someone at the head of the column winded the horn every now and then, and each time the sound came from a little further off. He couldn't see any of the others now, but of course he'd be able to as soon as he got round the next bend. But when he rounded it, he still couldn't see them. In fact, he could see nothing at all. His horse was walking now. "Get on, horse, get on," said Shasta. Then came the horn, very faint. Bree had always told him that he must keep his heels well turned out, and Shasta got the idea that something very terrible would happen if he dug his heels into the horse's side. This seemed an occasion to try it. "Look here, horse," he said. "If you don't buck up, do you know what I'll do? I'll dig my heels into you. I really will." The horse, however, took no notice of this threat. So Shasta settled himself firmly in the saddle, gripped with his knees, clenched his teeth, and punched both the horse's side with his heels as hard as he could. The only result was that the horse broke into a kind of pretense of a trot for 5 or 6 paces, and then subsided into a walk again. And now it was quite dark, and they seemed to have given up blowing that horn. The only sound was a steady drip, drip from the branches of the trees. "Well, I suppose even a walk will get us somewhere sometime," said Shasta to himself. "I only hope I shan't run into Rabadash and his people." He went on for what seemed like a long time, always at a walking pace. He began to hate that horse, and was also beginning to feel very hungry. Presently he came to a place where the road divided into two. He was just wondering which led to Onvard when he was startled by a noise behind him. It was the noise of trotting horses. "Rabadash," thought Shasta. He had no way of guessing which road Rabadash would take. "But if I take one," said Shasta, "he may take the other, and if I stay at the crossroads, I'm sure to be caught." He dismounted and led his horse as quickly as he could along the right-handed road. The sound of the cavalry grew rapidly nearer, and in a minute or two, Shasta realized that they were at the crossroads. He held his breath, waiting to see which way they would take. Then came a low word of the command, "Halt!" Then a moment of horsey noises, nostrils blowing, hooves pawing, bits being champed, necks being patted. Then a voice spoke. "Attend, all of you," it said. "We are now within a furlong of the castle. Remember your orders. Once we are in Narnia, as we should be by sunrise, you are to kill as little as possible. On this venture, you are to regard every drop of Narnian blood as more precious than a gallon of your own. On this venture, I say. The gods will send us a happier hour, and then you must leave nothing alive between Cair Paravel and the western waste. But we are not yet in Narnia. Here in Archenland is another thing. In the assault on this castle of King Lune's, nothing matters but speed. Show your mettle. It must be mine within an hour. And if it is, I give it all to you. I reserve no booty for myself. Kill me every barbarian male within its walls, down to the child that was born yesterday. And everything else is yours, to divide as you please. The women, the gold, the jewels, the weapons, and the wine. The man that I see hanging back when we come to the gates shall be burned alive. In the name of Tash the irresistible, the inexorable, forward! With a great cloppity-clop, the column began to move, and Shasta breathed again. They had taken the other road. Shasta thought they took a long time going past, for although he had been talking and thinking about 200 horse all day, he had not realized how many there really were. But at last the sound died away, and once more he was alone amid the drip, drip from the trees. He now knew the way to Onward, but of course he could not now go there. That would only mean running into the arms of Rabadash's troopers. Oh, what on earth am I to do? Said Shasta to himself. But he remounted his horse and continued along the road he had chosen, in the faint hope of finding some cottage where he might ask for shelter and a meal. He had thought, of course, of going back to Arvis and Bree and Hwin at the Hermitage, but he couldn't, because by now he had not the least idea of the direction. After all, said Shasta, this road is bound to get somewhere. But it all depends on what you mean by somewhere. The road kept on getting to somewhere in the sense that it got to more and more trees, all dark and dripping, and to colder and colder air, and strange icy winds kept blowing the mist past him, though they never blew it away. If he had been used to mountain country, he would have realized this meant he was now very high up, perhaps right at the top of the pass, but Shasta knew nothing about mountains. I do think, said Shasta, that I must be the most unfortunate boy that ever lived in the whole world. Everything goes right for everyone except me. Those Narnian lords and ladies got safe away from Tashbaan. I was left behind. Eris, Bree, and Hwin are all as snug as anything with that old hermit. Of course, I was the one who was sent on. King Loon and his people must have got on safely into the castle and shut the gates long before Rabadash arrived. But I got left out. And being very tired and having nothing inside him, he felt so sorry for himself that the tears rolled down his cheeks. What put a stop to all this was a sudden fright. Shasta discovered that someone, or somebody, was walking beside him. It was pitch dark and he could see nothing, and the thing, or person, was going so quietly that he could hardly hear any footfalls. What he could hear was breathing. His invisible companion seemed to breathe on a very large scale, and Shasta got the impression that it was a very large creature. And he had come to notice this breathing so gradually that he had no idea how long it had been there. It was a horrible shock. It darted into his mind that he had heard long ago that there were giants in these northern countries. He bit his lip in terror. But now that he really had something to cry about, he stopped crying. The thing, unless it was a person, went on beside him so very quietly that Shasta began to hope he had only imagined it. But just as he was becoming quite sure of it, there suddenly came a deep, rich sigh out of the darkness beside him. That couldn't be imagination. Anyway, he had felt the hot breath of the sigh on his chilly left hand. If the horse had been any good, or if he had known how to get any good out of the horse, he would have risked everything on a breakaway and a wild gallop. But he knew he couldn't make that horse gallop. So he went on at a walking pace, and the unseen companion walked and breathed beside him. At last he could bear it no longer. "Who are you?" he said scarcely above a whisper. "One who has waited long for you to speak," said the thing. Its voice was not loud, but very large and deep. Are you a giant?" asked Shasta. "You might call me a giant," said the large voice, "but I am not like the creatures you call giants." "I can't see you at all," said Shasta after staring very hard. Then, for an even more terrible idea had come to his head, he said, almost in a scream, "You're not something dead, are you? Oh, please, please do go away. What harm have I ever done you? Oh, I am the unluckiest person in the whole world. Once more he felt the warm breath of the thing on his hand and face. There, he said. That is not the breath of a ghost. Tell me your sorrows. And that is where we'll stop for tonight. So we'll see what sorrows Shasta shares, and let's see if we find out who he's actually talking to. Thank you for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next week.